Hello everyone and welcome to Marty Motoring. My name is Martin and what I've done is compiled 4 videos from the summer of 2021 into one easy to watch video about supercharging my 350. This includes all 4 parts of the supercharger build and the first drive and tuning and dyno and everything like that. I figured it'd be easier to watch in one video, and as you may know if you follow the channel, I now have a 2008 Lexus ISF and I have since sold the 2011 IS350 F Sport that was supercharged, but it was still a really fun car. And I look back to these videos and I think there's some good information in there if you're looking to do it yourself. So in order for it to be more accessible, I've put together this one video that you can watch all the way through. Quick disclaimer, I am not a mechanic, so some of this stuff may not be 100% accurate, and I just want to throw that out there. I tried to the best of my ability to be accurate and give correct information. Without further ado, here we go. It's a nice warm August day here in Pennsylvania, and we're going to start the process of supercharging my Lexus IS350. I got the kit from 𝗕𝗏𝗪𝗏 Racing a couple weeks ago, and I've been preparing for this moment. So today we're going to start it and see what all it entails. We're here at the 𝗕𝗏𝗪𝗏𝗪𝗏𝗧 shop. It's been in a couple of my previous videos. Big thanks to Steve for lending me the lift and tools to be able to do this. So let's show you what's in the kit, and then we can get this lifted in the air and start the process. This kit is pretty extensive. It's like there's a lot of pieces that go into this, a lot of piping. You have the intercooler, the actual supercharger, which is more of a turbo design. We have the blow-off valve, hopefully everything we need. And there's a lot of custom pieces from 𝗕𝗏𝗪𝗏 Racing. We have titanium wrap for the header, and this is the 𝗦𝗨𝗣𝗣𝗅 from 𝗕𝗙𝗪𝗟 Sport. That's what we're going to use to tune the car. Now this car already has the 𝗕𝗏𝗪𝗏 Racing tune, but we're going to need a new tune for the supercharger. We have to take off the washer sprayer system. Now a bunch of fluid is going to come out when we unplug this. So what I will do is take just one of the screws from the bumper, wrap it in some rag, and just try to plug this. I'm going to take the headlights off because I'm actually having them re-clear coated by a friend of mine. So you don't have to take those off, but I'm going to just for this process, and it'll make it a little bit clearer and cleaner and give us some more room to work with. So the next step is to remove this bumper beam. So before we remove the bumper beam, we have to unplug the battery just for safety so the airbags or whatever don't go off because we're going to be touching this area. We just don't want anything to happen. So I have my horns here and my little underglow wire, but what I'm gonna have to do is actually remove this. Braking clips. Okay, so it looks like the intercooler is gonna be set up like this. Find the bolt. There was no existing bolt, but that's where the intercooler is gonna mount. We did turn the horns around also. That was a little weird, but it provides more clearance. I'll line the intercooler up. I don't know if I should be using the bottom or top, but we're gonna do the bottom. There's an area I need to cut here, so I'm taking the stock air box out.
Since there's going to be charge piping in this area, I needed to take out the factory air box. You can see the blue F Sport filter as well as the F Sport box. I took out the front ducting as well as the passenger side brake ducting.
So now that we've removed the brake duct, the charge piping will be able to go in that area, and we can cut this.
Next, we needed to cut a triangle out of the metal so the charge piping could fit through that area. Big thanks to Steve, who owns this personal shop and lent me all these tools for cutting. He was just a lot better with the metalworking than I am.
After cutting it, and just to protect the metal so it doesn't rust. So I've unwrapped more of the charge piping and connectors. Just trying to see how it's all gonna fit.
And now comes the fun part, putting all of the intercooler charge piping together. Now this part is a little tedious. You're just moving pieces around, seeing what fits where, adjusting, and repeating. But once it all goes together, and it goes together pretty well, it looks pretty decent.
All right, so here's the progress we made so far. We got some of the piping on there. Of course, we're gonna have to go back and kind of tighten these and adjust them as needed. This one kind of goes up through here with a 45, and this will go to the blow-off valve and to the intake manifold. And then we're gonna have stuff coming from the supercharger. There is a lot of like looking at pictures and trying to figure out things where they go. And I do have contact with 𝗕𝗨𝗟𝗟𝗪 Racing. So far, it's going together well. It's just taking a little bit of time. So here is the oil cooler. So this here is the 𝗦𝗨𝗣𝗣𝗪 programming device. This is how you load tunes onto the car. So now the software is installing after we've downloaded it. So now it's going through a reboot of this actual device. So now we're all updated. I looked at the instructions again. We just have to plug this into the OBD port and follow the instructions, and we can get the ID, be able to send them my ID file, and they can send me the proper tune. And now we have the screen here. We go to work, Lexus IS350. That's a chassis code. And then we want to go to 350 identification ECU. So once that identifies the ECU, we'll have everything we need. I think we have the file we need now, so let's go plug this into the computer, and that's what we can email 𝗕𝗨𝗟𝗪𝗍 Racing.
There's the file, and that's what I emailed to tuning@rrracing.com, and hopefully we'll get a new supercharger tune in a day or two.
So we're back in Hammerdown Motorsports shop.
The next step would be to install this crank pulley adapter, but I didn't have the tool yet. I was waiting on it from Amazon, and I'll have the link for it in the description below, and we're gonna come back to it later. So here's the actual supercharger. It is a Rotrex brand, and you may notice it looks like a turbo because it is a centrifugal supercharger. At this point, I decided to get the supercharger ready for installation. The first step is to install these fittings and banjo bolts. I torqued the bolts to 16 foot-pounds, and it was good to go.
We're gonna make sure that my headers are wrapped in some titanium exhaust wrap so that it kind of cuts down on heat. We also have the stainless locking tie and toolkit to put these on correctly. The headers are a little hard to get to, but I'm gonna try to wrap the front up there. So you can kind of see the little bit of wrap that I put on the header. That wasn't super easy to do, but we have 3 stainless steel locking ties and the titanium header wrap on there. All right, so I took off all the plastics underneath the car. We need to install this lower supercharger bracket. So now that the lower bracket is in, you can kind of place the supercharger up here, just kind of in there, just sitting there. And now we'll put the plate on, and then we can attach the supercharger to the bracket.
There are 4 bolts for the main supercharger bracket as noted in the instructions. A and B have spacers, C and D are at the bottom and go straight into the lower bracket. The next step was to attach the supercharger to the bracket with the 4 included bolts.
So this was a little tricky. Had to remove this plate a couple of times. I put the bottom one in, and then you put the supercharger in, just sit it there, and then put the main bracket. I did not put the Cobra. There's a connector, Cobra head connector for the air intake. I did not put that on, so I had to unbolt this to be able to move it forward enough to put that on. It's really, really tight. I'll show you at the from the top here, but now that this is all on, all the bolts are tightened, the Cobra head connector is on, but it's kind of touching the header, so you really need to be careful and have some kind of heat wrap or something like that. That's why they recommend it. It's very tight in here.
So I really should have done this first before installing the Cobra head silicone connector here. It's the sticky heat wrap. I put it on afterwards. You can see it's touching the heat wrap for the header, but it's a little bit of a heat shield and anything helps. So I got that on as well as the clamp. The next day, my crank pulley removal tool came in, and this is how I set it up to get the crank pulley bolt loose. The next step was to clean the crank pulley of any corrosion. So I ran a bolt through all of the threads to make sure they were clean, and I sanded the inside of the wheel.
As best as we could, we got the corrosion sanded off. I used a 40 grit and then a 600 grit, and it seemed to get it pretty smooth.
Next, I lined up and installed the crank pulley adapter plate for the supercharger belt. I used the included bolts and just made sure everything lined up, and I also used them to tighten down the plate to seat it a little bit better since everything was such a tight fit. It seemed to work correctly even though that wasn't in the instructions. And using the same tool and a torque wrench, I could get the main crank pulley bolt to 150 foot-pounds. In order to get the belt on properly and achieve proper tension, I had to loosen the supercharger bracket to move the whole thing either left or right, and once I did that, I could get the belt on and tighten everything back up. Once the belt was on, I needed to install the tensioner with the included bolt. But the only problem was the lower radiator hose was in the way and touching, so I needed to drain my coolant system, take the hose off, and trim it as the instructions stated.
So now the radiator hose is removed. You can see the belt with just a little bit of play, and we're going to install the tensioner. Here's the ground strap. We're going to have to relocate that later.
The tensioner has a groove that lines up on the bracket, and then the included bolt goes right through and gets torqued to 25 foot-pounds.
Now the tensioner is installed. The belt has nice tension on it. The pin is removed. This is torqued down. We're all good to go with the tensioner.
The next step is to cut the lower radiator hose about an inch off the bottom so that it sits closer to the fan and away from the tensioner.
So now that I've shortened the lower radiator hose, I took it off. I cut it about maybe an inch and put it back on. It's a little less close to the tensioner, but in order to get it about 1/4 inch spacing, I'm gonna need to zip tie it to the fan. It won't hit the blade, it just needs to be a little bit more out of the way so that the tensioner can do its thing. And now from this angle, you can see, other than once these are cut, there is sufficient space between the radiator hose and the tensioner. Let's continue. I started this day off by zip tying the wire that goes to the oil filter, which I assume is the sensor, out of the way of the belt, just so we had nice clearance. So you can kind of see in there, I had to reattach the ground strap. That was a little hard, but I got in from here. I don't know if I even really needed to detach that, as long as I detached it from up there. So lesson learned. So here we have the oil reservoir with the brackets on it. I just need to see where this mounts. I believe it's going to mount like this. This is the bottom, this is the top, obviously because of the cap. So I need to figure out where I'm going to mount this. Then we can continue with the lines and oil filter. The bracket that came with it, it's more so for the third gens, at least from the pictures. There's no cross member here, so I'll show you what I did. I did something a little different, made a custom mount. I didn't understand how the bracket works, so I ended up making a custom mount. I got some metal from the hardware store, some bolts and washers, just kind of mocked it up here, and it seems to be pretty sturdy. It's far enough away from the fan and the tensioner, so everything is pretty safe. I had some extra metal, so I made this. It's a little bit of a custom mount, and it is a little bouncy, but it's not hitting, which is nice. I just made some holes here, used a zip tie on this one because it's angled, and it seems to hold pretty well. It'll just make it a little bit more rigid.
I started to run the first oil line to the reservoir, and also got the banjo bolts ready for the top and bottom.
So now we have the oil cooler in place. And we have the first line ran from the oil cooler, goes through here, and then it goes to the top banjo fitting of the reservoir. And now this one coming out will go to the supercharger, and there'll be an oil filter between that we're going to put in last. And then the outlet of the supercharger will go back to the oil cooler. Once it comes into the reservoir, it goes out to the oil filter, which I tucked above the steering rack and below the supercharger itself. So this oil filter, it has flow going that way, coming from the reservoir, going to the oil filter, and then it goes to a line up to the inlet of the supercharger. So it's a little complex, a little tight, but that is in there. It's not gonna really move around. I did zip tie it to an existing wiring harness here, and that seems to hold it in place pretty good. And this is gonna be the outlet back to the oil cooler. So I have a line running from the oil cooler on the other side to here. Cut this, but I don't wanna make it too short. I wanna give it a little slack so we can zip tie it. So the outlet line is on there. We're gonna have to fit this S-pipe into the inlet with the air intake right around this area. It's a little tight fit, but if we can get it to work, it'll be perfect. It's been hard to work with, but either way, the blow-off valve will go here. We'll have our intake pipe with the MAP sensor there. We have the S-pipe going to the compressor. We have an angled one coming out to this pipe here. There's just an angled one going into the outlet of the compressor. And then we have this just kind of sitting here, and our air filter is supposed to go here. It doesn't look like there's a lot of room. All this has been extremely tight and really hard to do, actually. We're gonna continue up here and see how everything fits. So I don't know if it was me or just my inexperience with the kit and just being my first time doing it, but everything was just difficult at this point. Everything was very tight. I wasn't sure where parts went. It was a lot of experimenting and figuring out. The instructions aren't super clear about this part. They just say to put it on. So that's what I tried. I tried every setup until I found something that worked. So here's the engine bay as you last saw, but I have everything connected up. To be honest, this was really hard and very tight. I cut up my hand multiple times. I even bled in there somewhere. The angle of it is very strange, but it does go on. I kind of had to turn some stuff and tighten it into position. I did scrape a lot of the powder coating down here, just trying to move this into position. We have a clamp here. There should really be two clamps here, but I used one to kind of seal it because it was kind of an edge that would bend. So this makes it nice and straight. Then we have one here, and one here. It seems to fit, like it's not causing any problems, but it is hitting the air filter just because of how tight everything actually is. And here we have the Turbo Smart blow-off valve, the Big Bubba. Just like that, the blow-off valve is on. Next, I removed the cap on the intake manifold because this is where the air line from the blow-off valve will go to. I also removed the crankcase-free circulation pipe and replaced it with the K&N so that it vents to atmosphere. The K&N filter hit the bracket for the engine cover, so I removed that. Then, I used the included adapter to connect the vacuum line. Next, we'll be priming the system, putting the new tune file on that I got sent, and start up. So this is the fluid that it comes with that we're gonna put into the reservoir, and then we have to pressurize the system and that'll prime it. And then we should be able to do a startup after we do a quick tune. Put this fluid in with one of these, just because it's so far down. At the max. So we get a little bit. Alright, and now you can see we're right at the max line. Next, it was time to take the tune file that was emailed to me and put it onto the My Genius controller. Supplies table, we have the last of the parts and some tools that we'll be using. Here is the junction box with wiring. Everything to wire is in the instructions, so we're going to need to follow those. And then this micro squirt, which we're going to be installing. I'm not really sure how everything works, but this whole system is for the port injection to be able to control fueling. This is the last step of the whole build, but it is vital in order to ensure the reliability and longevity of the system.
Other than that, my friend Brock at 𝗕𝗓𝗪 Retrofit customized these lights and they look awesome, so I wanted to reinstall them and test them out. I went with frosted check marks and turn signal area, yellow high beam area, an LED in the turn signal that has a resistor so it works really well, and then the glass is etched with F Sport for the low beam projector. Also, there are what they call LED demon eyes in the low beam projector, which lights it up any kind of color, kind of for parking or shows or anything like that, and it's controllable with my phone. Also, one of my headlight tabs cracked, so big thanks to Steve for making a metal bracket. First, I laid the junction box in the engine bay and configured it in the right orientation with the red and black wires going towards the ECU location up front. Here is my attempt at soldering all the different wires. It is recommended for a secure and solid connection, and then also I do heat shrink tubing around each one of the connections to keep them watertight. Now these wires were for the map sensor, and it was pretty easy to do it off the vehicle, and I just used a lighter to shrink the heat tubing around the wires that were soldered.
So now the ground and power soldered on the map sensor, and this will sit in the engine compartment. But there's also this blue wire that is the signal wire, and that needs to connect to the micro squirt that's inside of the car. So there's these two extra wires that in the instructions they call it various colors. They're pinned on one side, but not the other. This one is pinned on the other side as well. So they're just two extra wires that I'm going to have to run. So I'm guessing this will connect. I can pick either one, and I can connect it to the signal wire and put it through the firewall to connect to the micro squirt. So that's what we're going to do next. Solder this last one, then the map sensor is wired up, and we can move on to some of the other stuff.
I don't know what was going on. I couldn't get the wires from the junction box through the grommet in the firewall to where the micro squirt is in the driver's side footwell. I just couldn't do it. I spent 2 hours on it. So what I did instead is put the micro squirt in the engine bay, which is not recommended, but I at least got to test it that way.
We also have the map sensor here. So it's the next day, pretty tired, worked a little late last night, and just got to a point where I wasn't thinking clearly, so we stopped for the day and picking up this morning. I kind of wanted to explain what I actually did because I feel like I didn't explain it well. In this kit, you get the junction box, it has wires that get run, and the micro squirt, which you pin. This should technically be under the driver's side footwell, but I could just not for the life of me get anything through that grommet. And I played with it for hours. Maybe we'll try again today, which means I have to unpin all of these, feed them through, and then repin them under the driver's side footwell. But for now, what I wanted to do was at least test the car in its current configuration, make sure everything works. So what you have to do with this kit, there's a couple different harnesses up for the ECU, and the instructions point all of this out, but there's 3 wires for injector in one of them, 3 wires for another, and then a speed sensor signal. It's a little bit of busy work, that's why I didn't film it all. Soldering was a pain. Honestly, it was my first time doing it like that, and I'm getting better, but all the connections are solid, and then we did heat shrink tubing over that just to make it weather resistant and like a solid connection. It's definitely an undertaking. Most mechanics would be more skilled than me and they can follow instructions. So I'm glad I got to do this full overview video of the whole installation process. It's been a journey. I think this is the 3rd weekend working on it. Of course, weekends are really the only time I have right now, just being a part-time YouTuber, and I have work and I'm traveling and everything like that. It's easy, it's just tedious, and there's a lot of things to figure out. and I figured them out along the way. So hopefully this video series has been helpful. Without further ado, let me show you an overview of everything that's happening, and then we'll try to start the car. So here's the car. As you know, I'll show you how the air intake works, the air setup. So this intake pulls air and it goes into the S pipe that goes into the compressor wheel, and then once it's on the compressor wheel of the supercharger, it goes through, you know, it compresses, and then it sends it out through this pipe, which is kind of behind this pipe. There's a pipe that goes down, it comes out here and around, goes into the intercooler, gets cooled, pushes through here, comes back down behind the headlight, comes up through here, you got the blow-off valve, and then it feeds it into the throttle body. This crankcase is just venting to atmosphere rather than recirculating. The actual supercharger itself is there. It's tucked in there right next to the engine. You have the traction fluid or oil reservoir for the supercharger, and those oil lines runs from here to the reservoir, and then once it's on the top of the reservoir, it comes out the bottom, goes through the oil filter into the inlet, which is over here on the supercharger, and then it comes out the outlet, and it comes back and goes here. It's a little bit of routing, but again, that's how you have to have it set up. I'm hoping the bumper is gonna fit. We do have the new headlights on as well. I can't wait to use those, see how they look with everything installed. Obviously very tight and pretty technical to install. I cut my hand so many times, I feel like there's scars forming over my scars. My friend Steve has other projects to do, and I can't take up this lift anymore, so I need to get the car running. That's part of YouTube. We can revisit this later. I'd like to also go to RR Racing and get like a fine tune, street tune, have them look everything over and just make sure I did it correctly. This is Steve's shop, and he actually supercharged his 2017 Camaro SS himself. He's making like 540 or 560 or something like that horsepower to the wheels. This thing is quick. I've driven it, 6-speed manual, and it's super fun. V8 with a blow-off valve. Without further ado, let's try to start this thing. That's a little underwhelming, so I gotta check over everything, make sure I didn't mess anything up. The car is very shaky, doesn't seem to be running right. But I'm also supposed to let this thing idle for half an hour before even driving it. So you can see everything's working now. It's very shaky. Supercharger is spinning. What I'm gonna do is drop it off to RR Racing so they can kind of look over my work, just maybe make sure I did everything correctly, which I think I did at this point. The car runs and drives. But I'm also gonna have them fine tune and street tune it, as well as install the wideband boost gauge. It ran rough because of a misfire and the injector wires. It was just something I did. So once I fixed that, the car started to run better. The car is on and you can hear it. Sounds pretty cool. We're gonna dyno this thing and see what it makes. As you saw on those dyno runs, we had to figure out how to get the transmission to stay in a gear to get a good pull. Once that was finally figured out, the numbers weren't coming up right. I mean, we did get 414 wheel horsepower on a run, but that's a little less than expected. It turns out the car was dropping fuel pressure after about 6,000 RPM, which is not good. You don't want that. It means we have too little fuel and the system's running lean, and the culprit may be the fuel pump. So that's the next thing we're gonna change. Unfortunately, I couldn't bring the car home. I didn't want to drive it in that condition. So I left it there at RR Racing once again, so that Rafi could change the fuel pump and retune the car, hopefully redyno it and see how it does. And I'm actually in Washington State right now doing some work for my job. Rafi actually contacted me while I'm out here and said he replaced the fuel pump in the car, redynoed it, and got it tuned to 429 wheel horsepower, which is awesome and way more than I expected with my current exhaust setup. We are going to be changing the exhaust setup to even something better, which should make more horsepower. And as soon as I'm done this trip, we're going to head to RR Racing to finally pick up the car and do a first drive. So let's cut to that now.
Fueling is done through this simple table. Fuel settings, B table. Okay?
Okay.
That's all the fueling is done. It runs richer when after a reset, and then it leans out. So we'll see where we're at.
Feels faster.
Well, LSD is only going to come into play at low speeds. Alright, so we're going to start around 3,000. So pretty low RPM.
I felt really good. Pulls
Yeah,
nice.
it's just
And
very linear. So yeah, that's the boost, okay? Oh, okay, 3,000. I'm gonna floor it at 3,000. What's the downshift? It's like 1.5, 2, maybe 2.
Nice.
2.5 maybe.
yeah, that's not bad.
It depends on how much throttle I can give it because it's what's the downshift.
Yeah.
So this is when we started. This is our first pulls that we did with the car with the supercharger, and yeah, it was falling on its face right around 5,700. We hooked up the fuel pressure gauge to it, and we saw that it was just losing about 30 psi fuel pressure, 20 psi, 30 psi. And at that time, we were like, yeah, definitely, if we can keep the fuel pressure up, we can make over 400 on pump. So here's our run at the very end.
And pump gas being 93, this just runs 93, so
Yes.
for anybody wondering. And then this is the runs with a new fuel pump.
That's right. So new fuel pump, plenty of fuel up here, running nice and rich, and it can just hold power like beyond 6. And now if we, with better fuel, we can get this to keep going up. We can keep advancing the timing and get it to around 460 even.
And this run, you can see the first run was 390 compared to now the car is 429 wheel horsepower. So initially the first drive is going pretty good. We did get a check engine light, so I'm gonna have to look and see what that code's for. It might actually just be for the misfire, and it also disables traction control. So that's kind of the part of doing these kind of mods. Every car is different, every car is gonna have its issues. But so far we are figuring it out one by one. We have a new fuel pump. Pulls. That was half throttle. I really, like I said, don't want to push this thing too hard. Just kind of break it in nice and slowly. But wow, this thing moves way better. I left all the traffic behind me. Let's see how fast we can get to the car in front of me.
A few moments later.
All right, everybody, I hope that was a good, thorough start to finish of the IS350 supercharged build. Started when it was not supercharged, ended with tuned, dynoed, and supercharged. That whole process was about a month or two over various weekends and days. Lucky for you, it's condensed in one video. So if you've enjoyed this video, definitely hit the thumbs up. If you'd like to see more Lexus content, hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel out. Drop a comment. What do you think of the build? Would you rather have the IS350 F Sport or an ISF? I've had both, and I really am enjoying the ISF with the V8 and the 8-speed transmission. But the supercharged IS350 was very fun too. With all that said, thank you for watching, and as always, keep those wheels turning.